Thanks for joining us for OSHA's $700 million funding increase violations that every inspector will be looking for webinar. My name is Holly Foxworth. For those of you who may be new here, I am a registered nurse. I'm also the marketing manager for content. And as usual, I have a great panel that's joined. And so we're going to cover everything from A to Z today. We'll introduce them soon. But before we get to that, I did want to tell you of some exciting information that we actually just announced internally this week. And I think that you guys will really, really appreciate it. So obviously, we're all feeling the stress that's associated with this kind of pins and needle time period of that OSHA final announcement that's going to be coming out related to vaccine mandates and testing, et cetera. So I'm sure we all agree that the questions far outweigh what those answers are at this point, and that really makes it difficult to be able to solve for the, how, why, and now. How can you make all of those things work? So realizing that, we see and we recognize that this is more than just a vaccine and a testing challenge. This is really one of those time periods that's going to really question the new framework of what it is that we can do to protect not only our workplaces, but also our workforces. So we're going to have to put some thought into how is it that you're going to keep data safe and secure? How is it that you're going to be able to make some of those hard employment decisions? And what are the implications of that? What are, how is it that you're going to be able to have your employees' information about who's vaccinated, who's not, who's been tested, and what those results are? How are you going to be able to show that and prove that at a moment's notice in the event that OSHA were to walk on for an unannounced visit that's there? And then so just some other things that come along with those resources that you're going to need, what those processes look like, and really just the risk also that are associated with not just the fines for noncompliance, but also the dings and reputation that takes a hit there, not only for you personally, but also your organization. So we are really excited. We're putting together a half-day summit. It's a free event. The name actually is called, we've titled that Fast Track to OSHA COVID Compliance. And so that's going to walk you through everything. It's like I said, it's a half-day event, but it's going to talk through interpretation of some of these mandates, how it is that you can develop some of these policies and processes, your data security that we've mentioned, and also bringing in that other component of that. This actually is kind of one of those steps in that direction towards total worker health again. And so making all those ideas work. What is it that you can do? How can you pull this all together in a short time period? So this is actually probably going to be about 8 30-minute sessions. And we will host this on Thursday, October the 28th, and it's going to start at 9:00 a.m. Central, that's Central Time. So if you want to reserve your seat today, please do so. And the way that you will do that is by clicking on that Register Now button that's located right there at the top of your screen. That's usually where we talk about the next webinar that's coming up, but this is actually going to be the summit. So just click on that. It'll take you to a page. You are going to have to put in your information this time. Normally it just kind of carries over, but you'll put in your information and then just check all the boxes that relate to each of those individual sessions, and that'll get you signed up. The other piece is please feel free to share this. I know that we couldn't be the only ones that have some of these very same questions. So there's a lot of benefit that comes from helping other people through times like this. And we know that you have the opportunity to do that by sharing some of this information. So if you'll make sure and get yourself registered today and then also share that out to others, that would be fantastic. And we're really excited as we put some of the finishing touches on what the summit will be able to bring. So outside of that, just a reminder that at the bottom of your screen, that's where you find those widgets at the bottom. And so there are some additional resources there. If you haven't seen any of those so far, they cover everything from, how it is that you can implement a testing program to vaccine management, what you need to be looking at, infection control policies, et cetera. And then obviously some additional information about things like the Check Into Work app and what you may be able to access through there. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and let's have our panel introduce themselves, and then we will jump into the information. So how about we let's start with Dara. We don't normally start with her each time. So let's start with Dara, then we'll go to Dr. Cherry, and then we'll go to Chuck. Dara?
Great, thank you, Holly. Hi, everybody. My name is Dara Wheeler. I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing Officer, and I'm really excited to chat with all of you about this. I know we've been having a lot of conversations and trying to help everybody get prepared for what impending regulations look like and what they may be. So happy to be here as a team to talk about that.
Fantastic. All right, Dr. Cherry.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Cherry. I'm Axiom Medical's Chief Medical Officer. My professional background is I'm board certified in preventive medicine, public health, and occupational environmental medicine. I've actually spent a couple of months rotating through OSHA during my medical residency, and I've been supporting the military, government, and corporate industrial operations for the past 15 years. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. The man of the hour, Chuck, with all the answers. Take it away.
Yeah, right. Hi, everybody. Chuck Kable. I am both head of legal and human resources at Axiom. I've been a lawyer for just over 20 years, and I've spent roughly half of that time as general counsel and an otherwise kind of executive leader of HR and compliance functions. Most of my experience is in healthcare. And I'm licensed in 2 states, Texas and Michigan. Happy to be here and kind of get into this stuff and try to help people think about how they can begin to prepare to comply.
Love it. Well, thank you all for joining us today. So just to kind of give you an idea of what it is that we're actually going to kind of go through here. And I think I may have forgotten to mention at the beginning, I see that some of you already figured it out, but if you have questions that you want to ask us or you want to engage in some way, you definitely can do so. Just if you'll type that into that Q&A box that's located right there where you'll see this information about the summit, it's the box that's right underneath there. So if you'll just type that in, we'll make for sure that we get to your question or follow up with you individually about that if we were to run out of time. But so for today, what we're going to kind of run through is just a quick brief review of the Biden OSHA mandates, the COVID-19 workplace, what you need to expect there, what that looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about raising the stakes on what's changed. We'll talk about the new outreach and far-reaching OSHA 2.0, as we're calling it, especially as they staff up and have some additional resources to utilize, what your employer next steps look like, and then finally we will go through that summit just one more time and then we will call it a day. So Chuck, I'm going to actually start out with you here and just ask if you could kind of talk through what's to be expected and what are we anticipating will be in this mandate.
Sure. So to be clear, right, I don't have inside information. I don't have a crystal ball. But what I do have is experience monitoring OSHA and everything that they've been doing over the course of the pandemic and everything that they're publishing, right? And so I think all of that information is very instructive in terms of how OSHA is thinking about delivering on the president's kind of mandate, okay? Let's talk about that mandate for a moment. Very simply, fully vaccinated or at least weekly testing if you're coming into the office. I think that if you're coming into the office piece matters. The reason I think that matters is OSHA for a long time has talked about this concept of risk leveling your employees, and that concept is essentially if I have 100 people and 20 of them work from home almost 100% of the time, then those 20 people should be characterized as low risk. If the rest of the folks are rotating through retail locations, for example, and have exposure to people kind of coming in and out without regard for vaccination status, depending on the state you live in, right? Then those folks would typically be characterized as more of a medium risk. And so when you think about kind of the risk level, that directly translates into the way in which you're managing that part of your employee population. So my working assumption is we should expect to see some balance between the requirements announced by the president and the historical context that OSHA has used to come up with structure for employers to make sure that their businesses remain safe, okay? And so another place that I look and that I've referred to heavily in the past on webinars is the emergency temporary standard for healthcare. Now, obviously, that population is very high risk because they are actively kind of engaging with people that are diagnosed with COVID. And so clearly the standards and the approach taken there is probably going to be somewhat more robust than what you may see in an emergency temporary standard for non-healthcare. But there are certain key components of that standard that I think we should all consider to be kind of becoming part of this new standard once it's announced, or at least are very kind of ripe candidates to be included. Things like physical barriers, PPE, wearing face masks when appropriate. Vaccination matters in terms of where you fit on a risk standard, depending upon any kind of pre-existing conditions you may have, for example. And so that can bring you up or down. It can change the nature of PPE that may be required, right? Respirator protection programs, for example, is another great way that people can protect themselves from exposure. But then there is a consistent reference by OSHA to a layered approach to maintaining worksite safety. I think we're going to continue to see that, right? There are studies coming out every day Scott can speak to this better than I can on the clinical side, but there are studies coming out every day that speak to the fact that vaccination status is not the same as and I cannot infect anybody. And so there still needs to be steps taken to ensure a baseline level of infection prevention and control in a workplace. The layered approach that's been announced, at least in the healthcare side, includes, as I said, the PPE and physical barriers, for example. Vaccination can kind of help you exempt out of some of those situations. Ironically, in the healthcare standard, that may change. But then also there's this concept of a daily healthcare attestation, okay? You've heard us talk about this time and time again. If you're one of our clients, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is a daily check-in, essentially, with your team members where they are actively asked to identify if they have any telltale signs of infection, okay? And the point of this is not to keep people out. It's to make sure that when they show up, they're not actively sick, right? And with COVID, we thought we had a pretty good understanding of symptoms and symptomology around it. That continues to evolve. The nice thing about kind of an approach that a lot of businesses are taking is you can modify your question structure. I think there's a certain key set of questions that have to remain standard. But obviously, that daily healthcare assessment establishes the baseline for your entire workforce. So you can begin to understand what it takes to record in a COVID log, for example, which I do expect to be part of this standard, right? That's in the healthcare standard. You got to record when you got a COVID case that's been acquired at work. You need to be able to track all these data points, right? And so I don't want to jump too far ahead, and I want to pause here to let anybody else comment as to kind of where things currently stand relative to some of these concepts I talked about. But the very basic structure from the president is you have to be fully vaccinated or be on at least a weekly testing cadence in order to show up to the office, right? And so I think OSHA will take steps to utilize the layered approach that it's taken. There's also an employer guide that came out or was updated rather, I believe on August 13th, that you're going to see a lot of the same stuff, I think, because that document very closely mirrors what was ultimately included in the healthcare standard. So I'll stop there. And I know I kind of covered a lot in just a few minutes there, but I want to open it up. Scott or Dara, what do you guys, anything to add there?
Thanks for that, Chuck. I think from the clinical perspective, what we've been preparing some of our clients to think through, absent any direct specificity in the ETS, would be what type of testing. Would this be testing done at outside the workplace before coming into work? Is it directly observed? Things like that. How do you manage the results? Because if someone actually tests positive, what do you actually do with a positive result? Because essentially you don't have a doctor ordering the test, so you need to manage through essentially the employer is ordering the test, so they actually need to have a really strong mechanism to manage that positive result, because ultimately there's a lot of liability there if someone tests positive but doesn't actually get any type of counseling or action plan, especially if they end up getting severe disease, hospitalization, et cetera. So, but otherwise, no, from the administrative side, I just like to listen to you talk about this myself. So.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Yeah. He does.
Go ahead, Holly. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask that, I see that we're getting it today, and I've gotten so many questions this last week as well. about, Dr. Could you speak to whether you feel like that these boosters, that just seems to be a hot topic lately, how will the boosters feed into this? And would you consider that to be part of the vaccination plan is what's being asked?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that may be something that's really on the cutting edge of of what's happening right now at OSHA, because as Chuck mentioned, there's so many studies kind of coming in the last 6 weeks that are showing us a lot more information that may be lagging in the political process, where I believe the mandate is really meant to address the initial understanding of the vaccine of a near utopia for this. And now we're starting to see really good data that there is breakthrough infections. Immunity does wane over time, and that's a very interesting topic we could dive into. And then, is fully vaccinated then only for a year or for 6 months, or would you need your booster to be considered fully compliant? OSHA has about 14 or so required medical surveillance programs that we've managed over the years. And so they're very proscriptive on what you have to do to be in compliance. So this essentially is going to be a COVID medical surveillance program. And so it can have a lot of teeth once it fully is fleshed out. But also, there's studies showing natural infection may be provide very good immunity, or even maybe better immunity than vaccination. So is that going to be incorporated into the standard? Because there is more and more evidence showing that, but it just shows how COVID is on the cutting edge of, or we're on the cutting edge of learning more about COVID. And undoubtedly, I think the ETS may be a little bit lagging in some of that information.
Good point. Yeah. Dara, anything you wanted to add there?
I was just going to mention that, I don't know, we're going to dig into this a little bit, but on your screen here, you've got just what is the cost of non-compliance, and I think we can dig into that a little bit more. And I do think one of the things that I know Chuck has talked a little bit about is we have a lot of employers that are kind of taking a sit and wait approach until that temporary standard comes out. And one of the things that they've pointed to is the fact that a lot of inspectors, there just aren't that many inspectors in the U.S. And I know we're going to dig into that a little bit. But Chuck, how much do you think OSHA will potentially lean on kind of a whistleblower process, and what does that look like for employers?
Yeah, look, I think as an attorney for this business, right, that's what worries me the most, just generally in terms of risk. I think that, OSHA can hire a bunch of people to begin to kind of investigate, and or just randomly audit work sites, right? I mean, that's kind of what they've done historically. But I think what concerns me the most about this whole topic is the risk associated with kind of whistleblower complaints, because I suspect that will be the primary means, by which employers are going to become targeted, for lack of a better term. I think that whether you like it or not, the action or inaction that you're taking today is sending a message to your team.
Ooh, so true.
There's a couple lessons to be learned there. I think if you are taking steps to begin to ferret this out and to think about, the risks in a workplace, you want to be transparent with your team members and let them know that you're looking at it, you're taking steps, you're engaging in an iterative process with your team, your employees, to understand the relative risk presented of infection in a given workplace. Like you owe it to yourselves to begin to communicate the way you're thinking about preventing infection in the workplace. The other piece to this is you may have been doing a whole bunch of stuff up until this point. How much of that stuff is known by your team and known by your employees? Because the greatest risk, I think, lies with them, right? Like in so many situations, it's like the gentleman who worked at Tesla, and I just saw that there was a verdict of like $137 million, right, against Tesla because he was racially discriminated against. One person can create a big problem and a big risk for a business. And so when you think about kind of the fact, and if you followed me on LinkedIn, you've seen me talk about this kind of idea that OSHA's advertising for a director of whistleblower protection programs. Like they're hiring somebody to sit in that seat to manage whistleblower claims that come across from, I'm sure, more than just COVID, but certainly COVID is going to play a really big part in that. And so, you know, when you think about the wait and see approach, I would caution you on that. You know, what's stopping you from at least having discussions and beginning to engage in an iterative process, which, you know, you'll hear that term in a lot of different contexts. A lot of times you'll hear it on kind of like undue hardship when you're talking about, you know, reasonable accommodations under the ADA. But I will tell you in the ETS for healthcare, there is an obligation for the employer to go through a worksite risk assessment and to engage with employees around that effort, right? So if you're kind of waiting until here it is, you know, and if it's effective at that moment, and assuming it's not, you know, enjoined based on, you know, legal action, right? There's not an injunction saying we're pausing on this, which, by the way, none of that happened with the healthcare standard. And even in California, there was an attempt to enjoin the standards in California. None of those were granted. COVID's a big deal. People, I think, are very concerned about doing anything that would kind of put folks at risk. So be mindful and think about it. How much is it going to cost to begin to have conversations with your people around the way you're thinking about it, what they see? You know, at least you're doing something, you know, to begin to scope out what you would do in the event that this standard comes out and it's what we think it's going to be. That's the biggest risk, right? Go ahead.
Before you jump into this next piece, I heard you mention the other day that I thought was something really interesting. And when you think about your role as an HR leader, and you think about one of the traditional roles of a lot of HR leaders out there, it is doing a lot of union negotiation. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, you mentioned the other day, one of the things we're seeing in our labor market today is almost pseudo-union behavior that isn't necessarily organized around a specific union. And I think that insight is really interesting when we think about how everything has evolved and shifted so much in the last couple of years. And I continue to see a lot of articles out there that say a lot of this labor market is really in the control of the employee at this point. Mm-hmm. So, you know, just any interesting perspective there.
Well, look, I mean, I keep talking to everybody that I'm kind of a book nerd. And so I talk about Atlas Shrugged a lot because I love the book. I thought it was a lot of fun to read. But ultimately, like the concept of the workforce voluntarily saying, no way, I'm not doing this anymore. Like you take all the best and brightest and they walk away. And, you know, you hear about all these supply chain challenges and economic challenges and business challenges, and you can't help but think about that, right? Like people are self-selecting, if not out of the workforce, out of the particular area that they're kind of bringing a bunch of value, right? And so when you're dealing with a labor force that is highly active in the way that we currently see this labor force, you can't put yourself in the position as an employer as being, I don't care what they do. You know, it used to be, you know, forget them, where are they going to go, right? We're not in that place anymore. And so for businesses that need people, you know, everything that you're doing is sending a message about whether you do or do not value that workforce. And it's time for, if you haven't done this yet, you got to think about that, because the cultural implications that stem from this kind of communication pattern or lack thereof will have repercussions well into the future. Whether you do the best place to work stuff or not, whether you do employee NPS scoring currently or not, you've got to face facts. Like there will be consequences if you're in a place where you're highly dependent on labor and that labor is making a decision to leave because they don't trust you, they don't like you, they feel like they're not treated fairly. It's time to kind of figure that out and dig in and try to understand what challenges you're dealing with so you can begin to communicate, you know, how do we value our folks? You know, what are we doing to make sure that they feel safe and secure and valued in the workplace, right? Because that's the fundamental consequence of action or inaction. People are judging you based on your behavior all day long, every day. That's true for all of us individually, and it's true for us as a business. And so if you're interested in retaining people and or acquiring new talent that is able to do the job you need them to do, this could be a really big piece of that, depending upon where it goes in the future. We don't know, but we certainly think that our work lives are changing forever based on this event, this pandemic.
Right, for sure. Well, Chuck, kind of move into the other piece here is we kind of defined as raising the stakes, but the question was, we were hearing that, well, how bad could these fines be? And is that just a cost that's associated with running a business? And so do you have any additional information that would take us through or help us understand how the fines for this could be different based on the current bills that are there and how that could increase?
Well,
what that could look like?
Sure. I mean, I don't have anything specific other than I can anecdotally, let's look at healthcare for a minute, right? Let's talk about HIPAA and the Office of Civil Rights and the way in which they're managing HIPAA violations, right? At first, they were making some small examples here and there, but as that standard has become more normalized and as there are kind of very consistent requirements over health systems, for example, and now they have to maintain patient confidentiality, the consequences these days can be severe, multi-million-dollar fines, as well as government oversight for the next, 5 years, call it, right? With annual reporting requirements demonstrating improvement. So I'm not suggesting that you're going to see kind of a similar path taken with the OSHA emergency temporary standard, but make no mistake, $700+ million over the next, 10 years or whatever, that's still a lot of money, and they're still going to do something with it. And if they can begin to generate additional revenue to kind of fulfill the mission related to what they're doing, they're going to probably do that. And they're going to make some examples, if we find some kind of onerous behavior out there. Onerous in this context, maybe meaning not doing anything. Not necessarily doing something bad, but just saying we're not going to do anything. We can't afford it, therefore we're not going to do anything. Yeah. Which obviously every business has to manage that risk on its own, but we'll see where it goes. But I think the magnitude of fines that are being discussed in the bill are material, and I don't necessarily believe that any business is going to be positioned to say, we'll take the hit. I mean, maybe Apple would. I don't know. They got a lot of cash, but I just don't see that as being a rational business solution, given the relative cost of having some level of compliance. And by the way, everything we've been talking about is related to cost, right? The cost of a high turnover rate, the cost of losing good people. You've got the cost of complying. Yes, I understand, right? There's a cost to be had there, to be spent to maintain compliance. But what's the alternative, right? People saying, you don't care about me, I'm out of here. In a job market that's highly competitive, depending upon, the kind of work that you're doing. And so, all that has to be, put together in the decision matrix when you begin to evaluate the right path forward.
And Chuck, go ahead, Scott.
One thing I would just like to add, something that I've been thinking through as well is, obviously with OSHA addressing COVID, there's going to be some type of spillover into the workers' comp system, undoubtedly. I've spent a lot of time in my career determining work-relatedness based on the mechanism of injury, the facts of the case. And so before COVID, a lot of infectious diseases that were also well established outside the workplace were not considered work-related. With this moving forward, undoubtedly the discussion or the adjudication of work-relatedness can be much more complex. So I think a great proactive measure for companies is to have a very robust policy and actual practices that you could show an adjudicator in workers' comp that it's more likely than not that their employee may have gotten COVID outside of the workplace than in the workplace. We do a lot of that analysis for some of the entertainment business where we show 1/10 to 1/50 of the infection rate for the employee populations that we manage compared to the region that they're located at. And I think that would also bid well for the potential workers' comp claims being going to be potentially going out for work-related COVID cases. So, obviously it's more of a lagging indicator. We know at Axiom that sometimes there's different buckets or leadership in the companies that deal with risk versus safety versus health, but really having a holistic approach about risk is really key, I think, as well. And you're going to get dividends or ROI for a good COVID protection plan. One, protecting your employees' reputation, but also on these lagging indicators such as workers' comp.
Totally agree, Scott. That's a great addition. And related to that, and I saw a question come through on this, and I think it's related enough that I'd like to comment on it. So it's the recordability of COVID. And so early on in the pandemic, OSHA came out and said, yes, it can be recordable. They did modify the way in which they believe they're attempting to address kind of the actual inspection related to that kind of a finding. And the way that it was an interesting pivot, and we had some webinars that talked about this as well. They essentially said that when OSHA was investigating what the work relatedness or the recordability of COVID, whether it was acquired at work or not, they essentially were going to audit the process by which the employer made the decision that it was or was not acquired at work. So, which is almost more onerous, right? Because then it's essentially an audit of your entire policy and process and procedures and how you're running it, how you're tracking it, all that stuff. And so I think that, I don't know how much attention that really got. I know we talked about it a ton because we were very focused on it. It's just the nature of our business. But that guidance never changed. It's still there. And so when you think about the relative risk of additional kind of compliance and enforcement efforts, that's still out there. That was under the general duty clause that OSHA came out and said, hey, this can be recordable. And by the way, we're going to audit. I always said attack. We're going to attack the process by which you made the decision. You have to have data to make these decisions. You have to understand where this person was, who was around them, whether those folks had been diagnosed or had any symptoms, right, through the daily health questionnaires, for example. You need data points to understand and be able to make these decisions rationally. Otherwise, what OSHA said was, well, you could ask them, oh, where'd you catch it? I caught it at work. Of course. I mean, there's a better way is the point. I don't mean to disparage or suggest that an employee is not going to tell the truth, but come on, right? We got to have process and procedures in place to manage the situation, not just the individual, right? And that's where the real risk comes into play in terms of analyzing that whole recordability issue, right? Because on a one-off basis, maybe the symptoms are minor. Maybe it's just like a cold and they're only out for a couple of days. But if that person is contagious for 10 days and they're spreading it to, every person that they come into contact with inside that plant or factory, and let's say one of those people is predisposed to severe illness, you got a potential death case. I mean, and ultimately, I wanted to get to this at some point. I may as well get to it now. So much of managing these challenges is based on what I'm calling the data cycle. Okay? You're acquiring, using, reporting, storing all kinds of data points that historically HR teams, for example, were not called on to manage, right? So we would outsource leave administration, for example, and manage those on a one-off basis. But when you have your entire workforce, or a good percentage of it, engaged in a kind of a daily, essentially a data exercise, and you're attempting to draw, business intelligence from that and understand where there's risk, where there's not, who's coming back in, have they reached their 10 days or whatever the requirement is to come back in free of symptoms, who's looking like they need to maybe pause and go out and maybe do a rule out to see if perhaps they have the flu, because guess what, flu season's coming. All these issues are congealing, at least in my mind, right? And so Dara's our chief marketing officer, but she's very much a chief strategy officer too, right? We don't want to undercut. We have a lot, and Scott, all of us, we have so many strategic discussions around this stuff. And the data cycle, to me, is the biggest kind of piece to this puzzle that businesses need to get right now. I don't care if COVID only lasts, if it's 6 more months and we're done and you got 6 months of compliance, you still got to get this together, because the other thing is you can turn it on and turn it off, right? So if for some reason we're all wrong and we get to a point that everything goes back to normal pre-COVID and we forget about this, right? What happens the next time there's an outbreak of some disease, MRSA, Ebola, I don't care what it is, right? Just pick something. You've got a process you can turn on and manage, and you can help kind of understand where you've got pockets of risk, because this is not just about, ensuring regulatory compliance. This is about ensuring that your business can operate, that your supply chain is uninterrupted, right? So it's time to expand our thought around, how this is impacting our businesses and our team members. Anyway, data cycle, very important.
Yeah. Hey, and it looked like that Mr. Wheeler was also asking what kind of legal compliance issues would come from tracking immunity acquired through COVID.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I have some very specific thoughts that I'm going to share on this. Don't have any frame of reference to suggest whether this would ferret out or not, but my concern over someone's individual immunity or immune status, okay, is I think that qualifies as genetic information under a statute called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. That act creates a bunch of privacy protections around an individual's genetic information, and also prohibits employers from making decisions, adverse decisions against that employee based on their genetic information. So we're in this weird kind of place where the fact of the vaccination matters, but the intended outcome of the vaccination is essentially protected genetic information, perhaps, right? So that's what, when you start to talk about antibody testing, for example, active antibodies and all these various kind of ways we can measure somebody's relative immunity, I think that may qualify as genetic information that's protected under GINA. What that means is you can't discriminate against that person based on their genetic information, right? So maybe there's a way, there likely is a way to manage consent and everything else to get to a point that we're retaining that information, but you better be darn sure you're not sharing it with the wrong people who may then take adverse action against that employee, potentially for something totally unrelated. But if you have shared information they're not otherwise entitled to, and that comes to be known, you're asking for trouble through EEOC claims, litigation.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit of color to this. COVID is so new, but we can look back at a very well-established medical surveillance program for vaccination, hepatitis B vaccine for healthcare workers. And so that's a required medical surveillance program. So every healthcare worker either gets vaccinated or they sign a declination. But one of the things that is common practice is to check antibody levels on someone who may not have their records. And a small percentage of those who become vaccinated actually never what we call serial convert, which means they don't generate enough antibodies to be detected in their blood. And so as Chuck and I have discussed, that loosely would be considered potentially a genetic issue. And so potentially it's very medically plausible that that's genetic information by proxy. And so immunity is much bigger than just antibody levels too. There's a lot of other components of our immune system that are primed with natural infection or with vaccination. And so if there is a focus on antibody levels, I do think you could run afoul of GINA that Chuck spoke about, but it could actually negatively, or it's not appropriately representing the medical science here too. So I wanted to add a little bit of color there, but it is very complicated.
Yeah, and I know. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, real quick. I know that I am sitting here listening to all of this, and as an employer, my stomach, and I'm anxious now because this is really complex. And I think not to lose sight of what Chuck said, he mentioned ESG and other reputational risks around this. So to the point of doing something and communicating and being transparent with your employee base and with your stakeholders and your stockholders and everybody, there really is, a lot of employers that we speak to, there is a cost to doing business, and there is this compliance cost. A lot of employers kind of ignore the cost of compliance, and it is something they deal with. But that reputational risk is so important to keep in mind, and it's getting more important, not less. And just sitting here listening to all of this, there's very, I think we'll get into this kind of what's next, but it's taking each step and building on the steps and building on the policy, building on the transparency, and communicating with your employee base and your stakeholders, because that'll be what gets us all through this and keeps us operational. To Chuck's point, that really is the goal: keep you guys in business and keep you operational.
And that's that's kind of the not the funniest part, but what's so ironic about this discussion today, right? So now we're talking about regulation that we think is going to come out, but when we first started kind of the webinars, and when we kind of dug in and began to provide solutions to help people manage COVID, people weren't doing it because there was a regulatory risk. They were doing it so they could continue to keep the doors open.
Right.
So I mean, clearly there is sufficient historical context for all of us to understand that doing something is better than doing nothing, right? Because we've had to do something up to this point. The difference is it hasn't been mandated. There haven't been penalties. We've been doing what we've been doing to try to just keep the doors open and or meet collective bargaining agreements, like, for example, on the Hollywood stuff, right? TV and film business, Safe Way Forward. And so when you think about it in those terms, it's like, okay, so businesses recognize the need to do something, right? Because by protecting their people, they were protecting themselves, themselves being the businesses, right? And so we should maintain that view and maintain that vision. I think it's a balance, right? Each business has its own risk tolerance, risk appetite, right? Has its own unique characteristics, where people are located, how often they're coming in contact with others, all that stuff, right? Like meat packing, that's a tough business to be in when you're dealing with infection control, as we've learned over time. Right? But they're doing it. They're doing it, right? They're doing something, right? TV and film, they were required to do something, but they got it together real quick, and now they're doing it. Broadway, same thing. Retail, retail locations, same thing. So.
Definitely. Chuck, I just kind of glazed over that one. I think that we primarily had talked about that before, but the overarching messaging being that early on, there was thoughts that maybe that you wouldn't have to comply with some of these things because they didn't have enough investigators that would be able to, it wouldn't have enough resources to be able to look and see what's going on. But it's your understanding as well that within this grant that those would increase, which obviously would translate to the risk of inspections. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's going to be more of them. But the other thing, and the thing that I kind of hit on originally was, and whistleblowers will be incentivized to come forward, right? I mean, so it's one thing just to have a bunch of investigators kind of floating around trying to see what's going on in different locations. It's quite another when there's this kind of focused approach based on complaints coming through employees. And so my guess is you're going to see a whole lot of effort to make sure everyone understands there are options to go to OSHA to complain about what's perceived to be a lack of good infection control. All those posters that you never look at in the break room, right? We're going to see a lot more of that kind of effort, but it may be more electronically, where they say, you got to send this to your staff. They have to check off that they saw it. So they've got whistleblower, phone numbers, for example. I don't know. I don't know this to be true for a fact, but that's the reality, right? I mean, there's a reason we have those mandated compliance posters in a break room.
Absolutely, yeah. Dara, didn't you mention something about that there was a tweet or something that came out this week where they were asking, the question was, would you be willing to basically file a claim or tell on somebody that you were working with if it was incentivized by $2 or $2,000 or $20,000. What was that we talked about this week that we saw?
Yeah, there was some social media chatter, and I think it was facetiously put out, but it was kind of joking about, what would it cost to tattle on your coworkers, basically,
Yeah.
and the general sentiment was like not a whole lot. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of cultural implications with the way that we've, and this could go down a whole other rabbit hole, but our existing environment with technology and social media and the way people respond to culture, it really will make a difference in the way that OSHA rolls out a program like this.
For sure. Chad, do you want to go through these? I think we've got about three more slides. I know we're running short on time here as usual, but do you want to just go through these?
Sure. Look, we covered, I think, all of this stuff generally in the context of the conversation today. What I would suggest is, I don't know the different folks that are on this call today and what your roles are, safety, HR, I'm sure they're all on here plus more, okay? But what needs to really be considered is, okay, we have a duty to do something, okay? Doing something means we're gathering information, right? This concept of data cycle, okay? Acquire, store, use, and report. That's the cycle that we're going to engage in with our employees' data. You better make darn sure that you have a good process in place to track all of that information. Make sure you have a good place to store it, because a lot of it may very well belong in the confidential HR portion of their HR file, right? Make sure you've got limited access. Only those people that need to know can get to it. And make sure you've got the right protocols in place in terms of communicating around that data, right? Ultimately, all of that should be controlled by your policy framework. And yes, I'm sorry, you're going to have to write something down. It's going to be a policy approach, right? Find somebody to help you write it or write it yourself. Whatever the right approach is, engage in that approach. I mean, we've spent a lot of time coming up with what we think is a pretty good, baseline. I think it's really good because I wrote it. But the bottom line is, like, you got to come up with an approach and communicate with your folks, right? You cannot get away with not communicating with them. It's going to serve you well. It is. They will see you doing something. They will respect that, and they will help you figure this out, right? There's going to be bumps in that road, yes, as there always are. But it is the right thing to do to make sure you're sending the right message to your teams. We can't all be Disney, right? We can't all kind of have that great place to work, here's how we do it, right? But we have to take steps to make sure that people understand that we are looking out for their safety, because by looking out for their safety, we are ensuring our own, right? Long-term viability. So that kind of sums it up.
Yeah, I think so too. Do you want to maybe kind of talk through some of the things that we're already seeing on the move? So we're seeing some big moves in different directions from a lot of different employers.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think mandatory vaccinations, requirements, healthcare premium, so mandatory vaccination stuff, right? So EEOC has said for years and years and years, yes, you can make vaccines mandatory as long as you don't discriminate, right? Which means you got to have the iterative process to see if you can accommodate someone who's got a medical condition or the sincerely held religious belief, okay? Medical condition, if you want to talk to Scott about that, be my guest. On the sincerely held religious belief, the practical challenge on those issues, unless it's blatantly obvious and there's no evidence to suggest this person has any kind of a belief system, which is going to be really hard to find evidence of that, I think. You're going to be left challenging the sincerity of the belief, which I think is not an easy thing to do. Now, what you can do is address whether by accommodating, you're creating an undue hardship on the business. And you can, utilize concepts of employee health and safety in arriving at that cost, employee health and safety, and in arriving at that decision. So I'm not telling you what to do, but certainly as you begin to think about how to manage, mandatory vaccination protocol, my advice would be tailor it appropriately. If you have people that work from home that never come into the office, maybe you don't have to make it mandatory and you can just have them test when they come into the office for once a quarter meetings and wear masks and have physical barriers? Don't know. Tailor it narrowly, and then make sure you have a good process in place to run through those folks that are raising their hands saying, wait a minute, I can't do it, and here's why. I have some concerns as I think about it on the healthcare premium stuff, mostly related to the genetic information stuff we talked about a few minutes ago. I'm wondering whether there could be a concern of discrimination based on genetic information because someone's not getting vaccinated, right? Because again, it's that, you know, the intent of the vaccine is to provide, you know, immunity, which is genetic information. So, you know, how do you reconcile? So that's kind of an open issue in my brain, right? But again, that's just me kind of, you know, pontificating on some of the challenges there. I don't know how it's going to pan out. We'll see. But again, there are a bunch of law firms now. This is, and respecting my lawyer brethren here, what I'm now seeing, it used to be an employment law specialty. Now it says employment law and workplace safety. So clearly, this is a big deal, right? Like, law firms are changing designations. They're talking about rapid response, COVID-19. Like, they're developing solutions to address the need in the market here, right? So that's the other piece. Talk to your lawyers too, because they can help. Or talk to your third-party providers that have solutions that can manage this stuff. Because there's a lot of folks out there, including Axiom Medical, that know how to help. So,
for sure. Yeah. Anything else? Dr. Cherry, you or Dara maybe want to add to this last part, just kind of about making your plans and how it is that you can make that happen?
You know, I think having been highly inspected in my time in the military for a personal reliability program, a lot of times we have our strongest people managing those programs. However, auditors actually want to see the evidence kind of let the process stand alone. And so you might even want to do a kind of a run through of the main person that leads this program for you actually be out and have someone who doesn't know your process ask questions. But the process should almost, there's a Latin term for it, Chuck. I was trying to remember it, but it should stand alone on its face. You know, you essentially want you want good people running the program, but you want a better process. And that's what the inspector is going to be satisfied with, just broadly. Because if you're just talking about what you do, it's not going to be enough for the inspector. So you really want to have the process well codified, so to speak. But that was kind of what was lingering in the back of my mind as we were talking.
Yeah.
Great point.
Yeah.
Really great point.
Yeah. Yeah. And Dara, could you maybe just kind of touch on, you know, I think that the overwhelming feeling that everybody, you know, continues to speak about is that how is it that you can put something like this in place in such a short time period, and how is it that we take on, you know, it's like we don't have as much access to other people for labor because we're in the type of labor market that we're in right now where that comes at a cost and it's very competitive. So is the thought that you could then rely on, not necessarily saying always has to be us, but on a partner that can help you get to that finish line, help you get this put together without having to take this all on yourself? Absolutely.
Like Chuck said, I mean, it doesn't have to be us, but talk to your lawyer friends, talk to your third-party providers. You know, in HR, especially HR and safety, they're very used to partnering with vendors to support the data cycle, like Chuck said, to work through a lot of these concerns. I think the scale of this has changed pretty significantly in the last couple of years. I don't think this is new. Like Scott said, we've had medical surveillance for a long time, and we've had a lot of these programs in place. But the scale is very different in terms of who it reaches, which industries, how to implement an overarching program like this. All of our friends in safety who have worked in respiratory protection and hearing conservation programs for 20 years are very familiar with this process. But those are in very targeted, very specific industries that have to address that on a regular basis. This is more broad, and it's much, the scope is much broader. So it's something to really consider and start reaching out for help. Get your thought partners in place and get them there fast.
Absolutely. Chuck, do you have any closing thoughts you want to share with us? So we can wrap this up.
I mean, we covered so much. I think this is like the good thing and the bad thing about every one of these webinars. There's so much to talk about and so much to consider. And I mean, every day, you know, new issues, new thoughts kind of arise related to this stuff. I think, you know, Dara mentioned ESG in the context of the discussion I had early on, just talking about, you know, you're sending messages to your employees. I think the biggest thing is just remember that piece. Your behavior is being judged whether you like it or not. And I'm not just talking about you individually, right? I'm talking about you as a business. And so if you can develop positive momentum by behaving a certain way, right? It's like we talk to our managers about how to coach versus how to boss. You know, be a coach with your team members. Let them know that you're looking out for them. You're looking for ways to make them feel safe and secure at work. I think an iterative process is always going to be better than just kind of standing back and waiting to see, which is, you know, easy to say if you're a company that's got, you know, 500 employees, easier. But if you're like someone who's huge, like GE or someone that's got, you got to figure that out. Focus groups, you know, regional leadership teams, you know, being in charge of kind of, you know, managing communication. There's kind of a matrix approach you would have to take, but you can do it. I mean, there's plenty of culture people out there that have done this for years that can help manage, you know, the flow of information and make sure you're getting all the right information to manage the risk, which ultimately is what we're all trying to do. So
Definitely.
That's it.
Yeah. Before I let you go, though, I did want to ask one more question that we seem to get a lot, which is that, you know, do you feel like that there will be challenges to this, and will those challenges impact the initial start or authorization of getting these things moving in that direction?
So probably there will probably be challenges. I'm sure my home state of Texas will be first in line, respectfully, but I don't know what's going to happen. I think you can have, it's much like, I hate to use Texas as an example, but, you know, there was a federal judge that enjoined the activation of Texas's most recent abortion law, for example. I'm not trying to get political. I'm just, you know, that happened. And so whether the jurisdiction has a judge in it that is sympathetic, you know, to the kind of voices that are being, you know, used in making a case to pause on this remains to be seen. Again, what I've seen in terms of the COVID era is not a lot of success in joining activity. Now, that being said, again, you know, OSHA has standards that it has to comply with when it promulgates emergency standards. And so that is where we will see challenges. Whether it gets enjoined or not, you know, remains to be seen. But I'm sure someone's going to file a motion for injunction or temporary restraining order prohibiting the application. But we'll see what happens.
Okay.
You know, that's a whole other discussion. I mean, if there's a grave danger standard, OSHA spent pages and pages talking about the grave danger to healthcare workers. I think there is likely a case to be made that there is a grave danger for other folks who are at risk, perhaps less of a risk, but then perhaps the trade-off is there's less of an onerous standard on those businesses. Remains to be seen. So we'll see.
Good information. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you guys are always such a wealth of knowledge in coming here. And one thing I kind of would want to challenge you guys is that in putting together the summit, obviously we'll be working on this next week, but if you have questions that we haven't brought up here, or there are things that you specifically want to know, send that to me by email. Send it to the coronavirus@axiomllc.com email address. And that will get them directly to me, and we'll make sure that we can kind of roll those into some of the different sessions that are going to be there. Obviously, this session and the summit is for your benefit, so we want to make for sure that we're able to answer some of the questions that you specifically have. So if there's something there, please send it to us, and we'll have to take a look at it. But otherwise, we will look forward to seeing you guys. If you haven't already signed up,
by clicking that button that says register now, and also share it with your colleagues. We will see you Thursday, October the 28th, bright and early. Thank you.